my fourth fireside chat. This one had to be delayed a week because my second COVID shot put me out quite terribly, which is slightly ironic, you could say, because we're going to be talking about things that make you really sick and maybe even make you sick enough to die. This talk is called Deadly Sensory, a history of poison tasting. I like to do an interesting talk once a month about something that's sort of rattling around in my brain as something I kind of want to get out into the world as something I just find super fascinating. And definitely the deadly sensory or the tasting of poisons is something that's really been sort of piquing my interest lately. So just a quick overview, I'm going to talk about my inspiration for this talk and sort of touch on a few topics I won't be covering because this is a pretty morbid subject. And I'm going to kind of like cut us off at a certain height of morbidity. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, talk about the purpose of this talk in its semi-relation to beer. I'll give you a few terms that we'll use throughout the talk, and then I'll dive into some pretty historic poisonings and the sensory notes behind those poisonings, and then look at a few famous tasters, though there aren't very many of them. And lastly, we'll finish off with some poisons you can eat right in your own home. Start off, this inspiration really stemmed from my sensory classes that I run for breweries. Off-flavor classes are often the most popular. They're the classes that sell out the most quick. They're the classes that breweries come to me and say, we want to do off-flavor tasting. And I find that rather fascinating because by and large, beer is like a really amazing tasting thing. You have 4 ingredients, malt, water, hops, and yeast. And with those 4 ingredients, you can create pretty incredible flavor combos. And yet people want me to actively make their beer taste awful. And they flock to these classes, which is really fascinating, I think, especially when some of the flavors that we add to beer are things like butter or canned tomatoes or things like butyric acid, which is literally the flavor of stomach acid. You know, when you're vomiting, that flavor is butyric acid. And so I don't really understand it, but I think it's because people are fascinated by this like bad or sort of dangerous element that comes with things that taste poorly. And so sort of, you know, my mantra is like, bad beer doesn't kill people. It can kill your taste buds, right? It can really make you want to spit something out, but it won't ever harm you in any way. And so, and just sort of taking that a step further, well, what kind of sensory does kill people? Asks my husband. And so my husband, James, actually sort of like gave me a little bit of inspiration to start this sort of research rabbit hole of like, what does poison taste like? Stuff that kills us, what is that flavor? What are those experiences, those palate experiences that people have before they die? And so that's sort of what I'm gonna look into. One of the things, one of the topics that I'm not really gonna cover because it's a real downer is mass poisonings. I mean, we could go into Jamestown and talk about Kool-Aid in the religious and cult-related poisonings. We could look into all of the toxic waste spilling. We could maybe even talk about horrible things like commercial food mistakes or packaging issues. If you eat a ton of romaine lettuce or bean sprouts, you know that these things are constantly being recalled due to poor packaging practices. And I'm also not going to cover biological warfare, which is really, really depressing. You know, that was a track that was like available as a chemist that I actively avoided, and I'm going to continue to actively avoid talking about war if I can. And also super downer that I'm not going to cover, but we shouldn't go forward without at least praising animals for all they've done for us in terms of poison testing. Napoleon famously used dogs to taste all of his meals before he ate them. More recently, at the Beijing 2008 Olympics, the catering staff used mice to taste test food given prior to giving them to athletes, the food, not the mice. And then just in general for pharmaceuticals or makeup, we're not going to cover animal testing. It's a necessary evil, but it, definitely is evil. So we're going to focus on what I'm going to dub as like fun poisonings, or poisonings that have like really interesting historical significance. So this is my purpose. My purpose is to find the flavor notes or the sensory notes of poisonous substances. So I have this little comic here that talks about, this dude getting poisoned by his date. He's tasting berries with deep earth overtones. That's in theory the wine he's tasting, and with a definite hint of almond. That is the joke of that's what cyanide tastes like. So that's sort of what we're going to be looking at with that lens as we move forward. Jumping into the terminology, pregustator is a term that means a taster of food prior to serving. So pre in Latin meaning before, and gustate meaning eating. Before eating, you want someone to taste your food. And this was like a huge cultural status, right? And political status in Roman times. In fact, this was such a huge job for so many people that it was actually a unionized Roman guild. Because so many people worked as pregustators, they actually needed to have working conditions sanctioned. So, of course, I have to have Indiana Jones in here as a meme. If you remember from Lost Ark, we've got the monkey eating the dates so that Indiana Jones doesn't have to. I could have used many stills from Indiana Jones because that guy gets poisoned a lot. Another term that actually came more into awareness sort of around the Tudors era, Elizabethan time, and a lot of Shakespeare literature refers to cupbearers as someone who tastes your wine or tastes your beverage before you do, in order to make sure that it doesn't have any poisonous substance in it. Again, this is still a social and political status elevator. If you have someone who can taste your wine before you, you must be rich, you must be powerful. And here, this is just a nice little reminder from Emperor's New Groove to label your poison cups so that you don't have to pretend to drink. This is a term that we're going to be using throughout the whole presentation here. This is the LD50. This is a term that means the lethal dose quantity that is required to kill off 50% of a population. Now, most of the chemicals that I work with and most chemicals that anyone works with will include this for rodents such as rats or mice. But, in stuff that's more widely used, we might see it used on rabbits or cats. And then of course, in pharmaceutical terms, we'll start to see it we'll see primates. Now, it's presented in terms of a ratio, which is the milligrams of poison per the kilograms of subject. So we'll assume your average American male is about 65 kilograms. So when you see that number attached, we have to multiply it by 65 to get how much would be deadly to 50% of the human population. When you see the, I'll be saying something like, oh, the LD50 for mice is this, I don't want you to think like, oh, okay, so if a mouse is that small, we just have to do the multiplication to get to the right weight of a human. It doesn't scale like that. You want to think of it more like if a mouse was 65 kilograms, the size of a human, this is how much it would take to kill off that 50%. And just for for your own little knowledge here, the LD50 actually is a logarithmic scale. So here's water. Yes, you can die from too much water. Here's ethanol. We all know alcohol poisoning is a legit thing. Caffeine, and then nicotine, and some things moving forward that we generally don't have to worry about. But you can see that this is put on a scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's logarithmic, which means this actually goes further and further out if we were to naturalize all of that data. All right, let's get into it. So let's talk about some historical poisonings. I really had fun finding memes because like poison is like a really popular thing in our media. And this is one of the oldest, is Snow White getting poisoned with the apple. All right, in Greek times, this is the first time that someone being poisoned was actually recorded by Plato. So Socrates was executed by forced suicide. He had to drink a concoction of hemlock tea, and then he had to walk around the room until his legs felt numb. And then they laid him on a bed. So this painting was done, I think, in the 1700s. So it's a little bit after the actual event took place. But here we have Socrates handing off the hemlock tea to one of his disciples or one of his students, still teaching his philosophical ways, talking about how it felt to be dying in the moment. Truly true to form here. And then, of course, we have Plato here, who physically wasn't there and is represented with this symbolic facing away from the actual thing. He couldn't bear to watch, so he wasn't actually there, but he did recount the event. So hemlock tea is something that you could taste because it won't kill you outright. It takes many hours and long gastrointestinal distress before you will die. But apparently it tastes sort of like parsnip and fennel, like really, really earthy. And it has kind of like a mousy smell, maybe like barnyardy almost. So the chemical that is super dangerous in hemlock is quinine. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. So in a rat, that rat needs about 100 milligrams to kill off 50% of that population. So one of the things I forgot to mention with LD50 is the smaller this number is, the more dangerous it is, right? Because it requires less per our mass. Moving on to Russian times, I also had my pick of the litter when it came to Russian poisonings, because it is culturally a very useful technique to move up socially and politically. And so Russian history and even modern Russian history is just rife with poisonings. But again, I was trying to hang on to that sensory element. So we get Dmitry Yurovich Samaika. Sorry to my friend Kelly. His chicken dinner was poisoned, and he spent an agonizing 12 days dying because of it. And one of the reasons I really like this poisoning is because the dude who did it, the chef, was nicknamed the Toadstool because he liked to poison people with mushrooms. And so he used, this was a loose translation, smoke potion, to blend the fungus flavors that he was using with the smoked chicken to sort of mask it. And this was a assassination attempt paid off by Vasily II, because I guess Dmitry here was talking some smack. So mushrooms are incredibly dangerous if you don't know what you're looking for, or if you do know and you want a really cool nickname. I love these quotes. One of my friends, I think Adam, who's here, told me this quote, and now I just can't think of mushroom hunters without thinking it. There's old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old and bold mushroom hunters. And part of that is because death caps, in particular, this mushroom doesn't have a discernible flavor difference from similar looking edible mushrooms. And so, good on you, Mr. Toadstool, for trying to blend your flavors and hide it. But apparently you didn't really need to do that because there's really no flavor difference from similar mushrooms. So in rodents, this rodent wasn't specified, but I'm assuming mouse. Alpha amanitin is the main chemical compound in death caps that can cause death. And I mean, look at how small, how little you need here, 0.3 milligrams. This might be the smallest LD50 on the entire presentation. So it doesn't take very much to kill you. It's really unfortunate that Dimitri took 12 of these to die, because it seems like if he had had a little higher dose, maybe he would have offed a little faster. Moving into Roman times here, I'm kind of jumping all over the place, I suppose, but you know, historically, this is pretty famous, and a lot of people attribute the fall of the Roman Empire to excessive lead within their structure of society. So everything contained lead. Household utensils like your plates, your cups, your forks and knives all contained lead. Paints around the house, you know, balms that you'd put on your skin, makeups for people who wore makeup, lead in the water pipes. Even ironically, celebratory goblets were made out of lead. And unfortunately, lead is fairly dangerous to humans. But you can understand why it was so popular, because it was easy to get a hold of. It was plentiful. And as a liquid, it was salty and sweet. As a solid, it was primarily sweet with a little bit of saltiness. And so, you know, eating off of a lead plate is going to add a little bit of additional taste to your food. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of lead poisoning is lack of appetite, but then also constipation and vomiting. So no way are you really able to absorb nutrients or like stay hydrated very well when you've had acute lead poisoning. And we actually know what this is in humans. The LD50 of lead is 5 grams per kilogram, right? So 65 times 5, that's how many grams that you would need in order to off half the population. Now, that seems like a lot. It is a lot. That's a lot of lead, especially if you just were to put it into a brick and try to eat it like a sandwich. What actually was the problem in Rome was that people were getting little bits of it constantly throughout the day, every day. And so eventually you do hit that threshold. It's really a horrible way to die. Cleopatra is definitely one of the coolest poisoners because she was so weird. Her target was sort of Mark Antony, but mostly she liked to experiment on random prisoners and slaves, and lower class targets who she just didn't like. And then she also liked to target Mark Antony's pregustators. And one of the things she would do was just like hang out in her lab and extract flower essence, is what she called it. And so sometimes these extracts would be poisonous, and she would test them on you know, various people to see sort of what reactions are. And so we actually can trace some herbal poisoning discoveries back to Cleopatra. She also liked to use random herbs, and one of her favorite ways to like administer poison was to extract venom, animal venom, from snakes and from spiders, and then she'd drench flower petals in that venom. And she just was really obsessed with sort of that dichotomy of beauty and death all in one. And one of her favorite was the lotus flower, and she continuously used belladonna as like one of her main poisonings. So lotus flower is something that you can taste in a tea. I recommend you purchase it instead of trying to make it, just to stay on the safe side. But there's sort of like an aniseed phenol element to the lotus flower that kind of gives like a vegetal aroma that a lot of people say is similar to green tea only maybe more on the earthier side. So green tea, anise, like that's not really my jam, but maybe someone else likes those flavor combinations. And it's apparently pleasant, has like a little bit of sweetness to it, and adds like a pretty heavy body to it compared to other sort of flower teas. Belladonna, which also is extremely dangerous, like has sort of like a cherry or like a dark stone fruit flavor and is super sweet. The picture I have here, these belladonna berries are really dark, but they generally have this sort of red tinge or ruby tinge and are sort of like pomegranate granite looking. So they have like a really, really tempting sort of color. And these in rats and mice, you can see a huge difference. It's okay to have a little bit of lotus tea. Belladonna, you really want to avoid. The berries, the flower, the stems, it's a relatively dangerous compound. It is in the nightshade family, and there are nightshades that humans can eat, such as tomatoes, that have a little bit of this compound in it, but so small that you would have to eat your body weight or more in tomatoes to reach any sort of LD50 concentrations. In America, this is the only other mass poisoning I'm going to cover because it's super weird. In 1922, 6 people died from eating a poisoned pie that was laced with arsenic. And what I find fascinating about this is we never actually caught the guy. We don't know if it was the baker or the baker's helper. This was like the first headline that came out. And so it was kind of like pinned on the baker's helper, but they actually both disappeared after this happened, and police never caught them. So we don't know who they were targeting or why. We don't understand any of the motive behind it, which I think is pretty fascinating. Nearly 100 people were affected, which is really impressive considering how dangerous arsenic is, that only 6 died. And what I find interesting and what was put in this little article is that people stopped eating the pie because it tasted funny, which I thought was really interesting because arsenic doesn't actually have a flavor or a smell, especially baked into food like that. It's just going to be so overpowered by the rest of the pie. However, it does react with your saliva to create sort of like a metallic flavor, or like super raw garlic, like you just munched a whole clove. And so it gives you that horrible breath. And if you're eating a berry pie and first bite in, you're suddenly like, wow, that is garlicky. You would think it would taste funny and you'd stop too. We know, thanks to some really shitty people in the 1940s, that the LD50 of humans is about 13 milligrams per kilogram. That's just not very much, is it? So it's really impressive that only 6 people died out of about 100 people exposed to those pies. Another American poisoning that I think is interesting because it's not anyone famous or popular. This was a spousal dispute. This woman decided to poison her husband, Michael, with castor beans. I'm bringing this up for a number of reasons because we're going to get to the flavory aspects, but then also generally spousal disputes are solved with something much more violent, or commonly rat poison. So this is like really interesting because this woman had to go through crazy process just to get raw castor beans, then hide her tracks, then poison her husband. It's pretty fascinating, especially because, you know, castor beans aren't exactly known for being super poisonous. They're known for going through this super crazy process in order to create castor oil, which can be used as like a mold inhibitor in processed foods. So this woman would grind up castor beans, which held ricin, a super dangerous chemical, And then she'd sprinkle it in his food. Well, he knew something was wrong because of how his food tastes, because the marriage was going downhill, and because he had to go into surgery to remove an aneurysm that was most likely caused by this ricin buildup. Now, what's fascinating about this poisoning to me is that ricin is generally a topical. So this is something you just want to get in the vicinity of a human, introduced to the skin. And it's actually a really popular poison for the KGB, and even allegedly today Putin uses ricin a lot. They have used it in so many weird ways, in weird little dart guns, in squirt guns. They've even had an umbrella that, like, when you open it, it shoots out this like gas of ricin that can coat you really easy. They've put it on doorknobs and teacups. So what's fascinating here is that we actually have this guy who's eating ricin for a few days. It's incredibly bitter. It is so bitter that he like couldn't eat more than a few bites of the meal every single time, and it caused like a burning sensation in the mouth that's sort of similar to capsaicin or chili spice, but a little more harsh. And so he stopped eating right away every time. In mice, look at this. Okay, that's even lower. That's 0.22 milligrams per kilogram in mice to take out 50% of the population. That's insane. All right. One more Russian poisoning before we move on. This famously is Alexander Vic. Oh my God, I just butchered this name. I'm sorry. My friend Kelly's gonna roast me for this. Poor Alexander here was poisoned in 2006 for speaking out against Putin, allegedly. His green tea was poisoned with polonium-210. And basically died within 36 hours after taking a single sip of this green tea. So his tea got spiked with the quantity of polonium that would be equal the amount of 1 grain of sugar. So that's the size compared to like a full 8-ounce cup of tea. And so he had 1 sip of it and stopped drinking it immediately. Said it was way too bitter, and then proceeded to leave the restaurant and go to his hotel room, immediately starting to show signs of radiation poisoning, which basically liquefies you from the inside out. Now, generally, we've only seen outside sources of radiation hit our bodies. We very rarely see someone ingest something that's radioactive. And what's fascinating, he probably didn't even swallow the grain of polonium. It was most likely still left in the teacup. But what's really fascinating was they were able to take a Geiger counter, which measures radiation decay nearby, and retrace his steps back to the table he sat at, the cup that he drank out of, the saucer, the tablecloth, his shoes, the carpet that he walked on. The moment he imbibed that 1 sip, his whole body was just throwing off radiation. And so they were able to trace his entire steps with a Geiger counter back. I think this is fascinating, even though it's really horrible. I think it's fascinating because it is literally the only verbal account that we have of what polonium tastes like. And that's like, I think, the peak of my morbid curiosity here, because that's really fascinating. It's just really horrible that we had to find out from someone who had to pass away for it. Whew, that was heavy shit, right? A lot of death. Well, let's talk about people who survived. And like, what's crazy is there's not many. And it's not just because, taste testers tend to die. It's because they actually tend to live anonymously. We'll talk about the most famous poison taster, and bear with me as I tell you about this soap opera. So halitosis was a pregustator to Claudius, and Agrippa the Younger was not a very big fan of the way that Claudius ran the empire. So she thought that her son Nero would be a much better emperor. So she paid my girl Lacosta here, a famous witch or famous poison maker, to provide halitosis with poison mushrooms. So famously, halitosis brought out the plate of mushrooms for Claudius to eat. He ate one, said, "I'm fine," and then quickly sprinkled a little bit of poisonous mushroom on top of the mushrooms he just tasted for safety. Handed that over to Claudius. Claudius, of course, ate the poison mushrooms, died almost right away. And so all is good except, oh, wait, actually, he had named Britannicus as his heir. And so Nero still was one seat behind getting the emperorship. And so they basically had to go through all of this whole rigmarole a second time. So there we are, halitosis with the mushrooms, eats it, hands it, or sprinkles the mushrooms from Lacosta over the safe mushrooms, then hands it to Britannicus. And here's this 1700s painting of this moment. And all of that goes through, and it doesn't actually kill Britannicus. He's super sick, but it doesn't kill him. And so they actually do one more poisoning altogether. They have Lacosta coat an ostrich feather with poison, and they shoved it down Britannicus' throat. So, I don't know if you need poison to kill someone with an ostrich feather down the throat, but maybe you do. Especially if he's still having issues with poison mushrooms. It seems like this guy had it pretty bad. So Nero ascended the throne. However, he did commit suicide only a few years later. I think his conscience got to him. So not much is known about this, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it. Stalin's rabbit, born sometime in the 1800s, passed away peacefully, unrelated to food in 1948. We think Sasha is the guy who is the rabbit. We think he was Stalin's brother, maybe half brother. And he basically followed Stalin around, nibbling at his food. He was like Stalin's right-hand man, not in any terms of political power or carrying out orders or logistics, but sheerly just to be there to taste whatever Stalin was about to taste before him. Stalin even went as far to test his loyalty as to kill the rabbit's wife in front of him, and the rabbit still steadfastly held on to this pregustator role and passed away of natural causes at old age. Interesting side note, the chef that the rabbit was working with in order to provide food for Stalin is Putin's grandfather. So that's super fascinating. Just let that sit with you for a sec. All right, this is Margot Volk. She's probably the most badass person on this presentation because she was one of the only survivors of Hitler's food taster group. So she passed away in 2014. She rested in power. She was put into a group of 20 to 30 women who at first, like when he was first rising to power, they were allowed to like stay in their own dorms and kind of have their own life, and they would rotate out different times to go and have Hitler's meal before Hitler. But as things were getting escalated, Hitler became more paranoid. He actually would keep them all in his quarters, but he would basically rotate them out. So it was possible that if you met one girl one day while you were waiting for food, your group would be moved and split up and moved around so that you might not ever see that woman again. And so she actually has no account for how many women actually prevented this by dying, because there were tons of women she just naturally never saw again. And so this sort of left her with like a paralyzing fear of food, that like horrible moment where you eat something and then you have to just wait to die, maybe, or not. But she, wrote a couple memoirs on it. I highly recommend getting into it, but it is heavy. So she's a badass, and we'll hopefully remember her for always for what she had to go through. All right, then we're going to get into something a little more recent. So it turns out that all of our US presidents have always had food tasters. It just turns out that most of them have managed to stay anonymous. And most of our presidents have had a chance to keep this on the down low so that we don't make a big deal out of it. Well, President Obama had to go to a conservative dinner, and the Republicans there didn't, for whatever reason, plan this ahead of time. And so his food taster wasn't there. And so Obama was not able to eat with this group. And Susan Collins was super upset with that and basically wrote a tweet about Chef Andrew, this guy that apparently is supposed to be there with Obama tasting food. The tweet was deleted within the hour. I think you can still find screenshots of it around, but I didn't look very hard. What's interesting is that later someone was going through records, and no one named Andrew was ever actually employed by the Obamas in the kitchen staff. And the Secret Service has refused to comment. So this is the only name. We think that maybe there's, maybe it's his pseudonym or just a code name. So Chef Andrew is one of the first American president food tasters to ever be outed in any sort of way, which is really fascinating because, a few centuries ago, it was a political prestige to have a food taster. Now it's something you don't want to flaunt, even though we know that Putin and Queen Elizabeth both used food tasters, and Justin Trudeau used it when he last traveled to China. So these are still employed today. There are not very many job openings on LinkedIn for pregustators, but maybe times will change. Okay, let's talk about stuff that you can eat at home that's poisonous. I will not be talking about animal products because either A, they're too gross, or B, you probably don't have them. It's possible you have raw or unpasteurized milk. Those are super dangerous because of the bacteria that can culture there. I really don't want to talk to you or show you pictures of maggot fermented cheeses that can wake up in your body. And so maggots can grow in your intestines. We won't go into that. Of course, I want to remind you to always wash your hands after, touching any sort of raw or unprocessed meats. That can be super dangerous. I won't also go into fermented shark or fermented fish or fermented eggs that get buried. Those are all dangerous in their own ways. And then I won't talk about eating live animals. I don't think any of you have an aquarium at home that's, ready to go with octopus. So I also doubt that any of you are preparing fugu, which is pufferfish. These are really famous poisons that humans eat anyway. We're just not going to go into that. I'm going to assume we're all vegan. There we go. Nutmeg. Go ahead and eat some nutmeg. That is a poison. It contains mystericin oil, which is just smells and tastes like nutmeg. It has like a really strong warming sensation, a little more mellower than cinnamon. And you can see here, look at how big this number has jumped now that we're into poisons we can eat. In a rat, mystericin is only 400 milligrams per kilogram. Cashews, raw cashews, and cashew apples, which is the fruit that grows around a cashew, is really poisonous because it contains urushiol, which is the same active ingredient in poison oak. And so this compound itself and the raw cashews actually kind of have like a lemony, earthy, like turnip sort of green flavor. So very bitter also, which I find, you know, it seems to be a common theme here. Mouse LD50 here, 73 milligrams per kilogram, so a little more deadly than nutmeg. And almonds, or, you know, wild almonds, or also known as bitter almonds. Hey, there's that word again, bitter. We've since mostly domesticated almonds so that they are sweet, but wild almonds contain a huge amount of a cyanide precursor that turns into cyanide when chewed or introduced to saliva. Cyanide, again, extremely bitter. It smells of almonds, imagine that, and cherries. So again, we know, actually thanks to Russia, the LD50 of cyanide in humans is 50 milligrams per kilogram. So not very much at all is required. So let's stay on this cyanide track because we have a lot of food that we like to eat that has cyanide. And one of the main ones is stone fruit. So cherry pits, apricot pits, peach pits, they all contain cyanide and those precursors. Again, I don't imagine you're going to go out of your way to eat these pits, but if you brew with whole fruits that have pits in them, it is something that you need to be worried about if you're using stone fruits. Elderberries. Elderberries also have cyanide, but let's talk about elderberries because they're really fascinating. The whole plant, the elder, the stems, the leaves, the roots, all of it are incredibly poisonous. They all contain cyanide, and so do these berries. But luckily, if you process the flowers or you process the berries, that means to either introduce heat, introduce pressure, to cook them down in sugar, you actually break down those precursors and that cyanide into something that we can actually eat. I really love the Saint Germain liquor, and it was my first like exposure to elderberry, and you know that kind of has like a little bit of like a vanilla-y flavor. But again, elderberries, from people who have eaten them or tried one or two, like they're extremely bitter, and they look pretty, but they don't taste pretty. This is the ackee fruit, which originates from Southeast Asia, but became really popular when it was brought over in the 1700s to Jamaica, and it is now the Jamaican national fruit. I did a lot of research on this fruit because it's so fascinating. You absolutely cannot eat it unless it has been ripened on the branch, and this is what the ripened fruit looks like. These little black pods here that come in threes, those are the seeds, and they are inedible, but this fleshy bit here that's holding the seeds, that's the fruit that you want. And so ackee fruit, actually, there's two different types. There's the cheese type and there's the butter type. And they both have similar flavors, which is sort of nutty, maybe like a cream cheese flavor to it. It has a texture of like garbanzo beans or avocado. So the two different types are, I think that if you've never had the fruit, you probably couldn't tell a difference. But one is preferred for canning, one is preferred for fresh eating. And they contain this chemical hypoglycin. They contain A and B. B is like can cause gastrointestinal discomfort, but isn't super poisonous. However, hypoglycin A actually can start to shut down parts of your lungs. And so you definitely don't want to be eating this before it falls off the fruit or falls off the tree. And if you do pick it off the tree, you want to make sure it's fully opened. I really love starfruit. I was really stoked to see that this was on the list because it's something that I've actually eaten and enjoy. And we apparently can grow it in the Northwest. I didn't know. Starfruit is like super yummy. It has the texture of grapes, but tastes sort of like a citrusy apple. It kind of has a little bit of acidity to it that can kind of tear at your mouth the way pineapple does. And that is oxalic acid. It doesn't really have a flavor, but it has a tartness that's very distinct. And so oxalic acid in its pure form is actually pretty dangerous for humans and rats as well. I mean, 24 milligrams is pretty low. But what that does is basically gives you nonstop diarrhea. And so you're unable to absorb any sort of liquid. I put rhubarb here under fruit because I kind of view it as similar to the tomato. You know, a tomato is technically a fruit, but you treat it like a vegetable. A rhubarb is a vegetable, but you really treat it like a fruit. So these stalks are edible, but the leaves contain a ton of oxalic acid. So here's that acid again. And I think honestly, more so than with starfruit, rhubarb is something that you can really taste the effect of oxalic acid. It just leaves like a very unique flavor or feeling in your mouth. If you haven't had rhubarb, it's kind of like celery in texture, where if it's raw and you snap it, it kind of is fibrous. But it tastes like kind of unripe green apple, which is kind of a stretch. Rhubarb has its own flavor, but it's, how do you describe it exactly? It's just very tart and kind of fruit. And lastly, I want to talk about stuff that is not necessarily poisonous. I mean, look at these numbers; they're pretty high up there. These are all for rodents, except for this one, which is for rabbit. These are things that trigger our responses to food. So when you get something really spicy or you get something really bitter, there is an initial reaction to want to spit it out or to not swallow. And so capsaicin is definitely one of those things. So that's what is the spice element in chili peppers. We now measure the capsaicin levels in units called Scovilles. So that causes like a sincere burning sensation, and it's not a chemical our body can necessarily break down. And so that's how you get the infamous second burn. Ginger has a gingerol chemical that also gives you that kind of burning, spicy flavor. We see that in peppercorns as well for piperin. This is just like really fiery, but then also has like a really earthy note to it. Everyone's always like got that black peppercorn kernel like removed from your tooth, and then you bite down on it. It's just like, wow, that is spicy, even though it's small. And then I wanted to talk about wasabi and ginger and horseradish. These compounds, the allyl isothiocyanate, is a chemical that basically attaches to mucous membranes in your sinuses. And so that's what causes that kind of, even though you're eating it and it's up front, it causes that kind of out the nose sort of spiciness that if, you know, if no one prepared you for it the first time you had wasabi, you would say like, oh my God, I might die. This is terrible. And so these are our natural responses to these sort of tingles. And then lastly, the most famous of all tingly foods, the stinging nettle. This is actually a neurotoxin, this acetyl chloride. It's a neurotoxin. So what that means is when it comes into contact with your nerves, it sends a signal that says I'm in pain, even though to us, you know, it might have a little bit of swelling. It doesn't actually look as though there is danger or some sort of damage done. You know, nettles are totally edible if you cook them, process them, and harvest them correctly. You can avoid the neurotoxin. So one of the things I just wanted to point out is that something that we have innately accepted as people who eat things and drink things is that bitterness is okay. And for a really long time, as you can see with all of these poisons that I've been showing you, that bitterness actually might be an indicator of something that is harmful to us. And that still is a little bit the case. You know, lots of people who have aversion to super hoppy or bitter beers maybe get really bad headaches from drinking all that alcohol, right? And so they start to create an association, bitterness is bad. But it's also ingrained with us through our evolutionary process in eating foods. Bitter means bad, so we've generally tried to avoid it. It's only in recent culinary experimentation that we've started to add bitter in as something we really enjoy. All right, so now I am going to open the floor up to any questions you might have about any of these relatively morbid topics.
I have a question. Can you speak to at all, like I've seen arsenic like promoted in like homeopathic ways and like very, very like trace elements. Is that something that's common of most poisons or just some?
So I think it comes down to, is it, first of all, don't eat arsenic, straight up. You don't need arsenic. If you feel like you don't get enough arsenic in your system, like eat a couple apples or like munch an apple seed, because there is really no medicinal use for arsenic. It actively destroys our bodies. And so I would say, you know, there are plenty of compounds we don't like or that can be poisonous. Milk of magnesia, for example, that you can use to settle your stomach if you have a stomach ache. That's actually poisonous if you're not sick. And so, yes, there are times where poisons can be used as medicinal remedies. But if it hasn't been approved by, you know, an oversight board, and it's just, you know, some lady tinctures in her house, don't eat arsenic. That's a good question, though, because everything is okay in moderation, right? In theory. But I just, you know, how much do you trust someone who's trying to sell you arsenic? I don't
know. I think the discussion of the belladonna was pretty interesting, and you know, it contains atropine and scopolamine, which are both medically useful as well, right? Like atropine is what the eye doctor would give you to dilate your eyes, or and I'm sure you ran across this in your research too, but that's where the name belladonna comes from, is because women used to take it for beauty, to make their pupils bigger, and they thought it made them look pretty, but it was also poisoning them.
Yeah, well, and you know, that's not too far of a stretch to today's modern, like injecting Botox, right, for beauty. Botox is a poison. It is very dangerous to us, but in small quantities in the right places, it is something that our body can tolerate. So yeah, it's insane what we can do with poisons or things that are poisonous. with the right quantities, you can totally access a different aspect of that compound.
Fascinating. Yeah, interesting stuff. And one thing I read, the belladonna fruit actually has a tomato-like taste. And you mentioned that, you know, tomatoes were also
In the
nightshades, that
nightshades, yeah.
that it can either be used for savory or sweet, yeah, applications, which is sort of interesting. I've also heard that you mentioned the death cap mushroom, the Amanita phalloides. People die from that all the time these days because it's a very good-looking mushroom. Like it's solid, and
Yeah,
apparently
and it's like it's
it
relatively
tastes phenomenal.
similar. It's relatively similar to the ones that are edible, but there's a difference, and you'll have to correct me here because I'm not the mushroom expert, but there's a difference in the way that the gills lay that is characteristic of the death cap. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's something that I don't even get close to. Like,
Okay.
I would not try to distinguish a death cap from an edible Amanita mushroom myself, but I know people in other circles who have experimented with those, and some of them are very tasty. And even the Amanita muscaria, the pretty red ones with the little white dots on them.
The Mario mushrooms.
Yeah, yeah. The ones that you expect to see like a little, you know, like imp under or something like that. I don't know.
Mhm.
But yeah, they're poisonous, but you can cook them for long periods of time.
And break down
And
that poison.
it breaks down the poison and extracts it. Actually, you have to keep changing the water out and stuff, and boil it for a long period of time to extract it. And apparently they're edible then. And other mushrooms, sorry, not to keep going on this subject,
No,
but
it's good because I had to stop myself from going down the mushroom rabbit hole because I feel like that's a whole talk in itself, is just like talking about poisonous mushrooms, which is why I only sort of focused on the most deadly.
oh yeah, yeah. There's one that I think is really interesting though. I think it's a type of ink cap, but it's toxic when combined with alcohol. And so it's one of these mushrooms
Ooh,
that
cool.
you just can't drink wine or anything with your meal, or they are poisonous. So yeah, some
Well,
things.
and sort of the converse of that is there's certain snake venoms that when combined with alcohol, you can then drink, right? And
Oh,
so like there's certain snake venom shots that you can get. I don't think they're legal in the US, but you can definitely go out of the States and find snake venom shots.
wow.
Yeah.
Such a fascinating subject. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I know. That's why I really had to dial in what I was going to talk about, because there's just so many things out there that are bad for us that can do serious damage. But I really wanted to see sort of like what's the theme here when it comes to poisonous things, and it's like other than lead, it's bitterness. Bitterness is like one of the main indicators that something's off.
And I read that not too long ago they discovered bitter receptors like in your trachea or something also,
Oh,
or
cool.
maybe in the
Really?
esophagus. Um, um, and so, which sort of indicates that it's much more important, like beyond just a sensory, like tasting bitterness, to detecting, you know, important things that may be potentially deadly. So
Yeah, and I
yeah.
wonder if that's something that will like send a signal then to your stomach, like you need to throw this up right now. Like
Right.
that might be one of the indicators. That's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciate your presence here. Next month, I am going to be talking about beer again. So for you beer people, like we'll be back at it. And we're going to just talk about identifying different microbes using gram staining and what that process looks like.